Good morning. I'm Mike Niehaus. I'm here with Ben Hunter today. Hopefully I'll get through this session and still have a voice after last night. Today we're here to talk about what's new in MDT 2012. How many of you have already downloaded MDT 2012? That's just really impressive. Just to give you some idea of where we were in the past with MDT 2010 Update 1, we track the download numbers just to keep some reasonable justification for our existence. And we've had about 600,000 downloads for MDT 2010, averaging about 27,000 a month. In about February, they started doing some advertising on the Microsoft.com webpage to say, do you know XP is near its end of days? Download MDT. So at that point, our downloads have jumped up above 40,000 a month. Hopefully, with MDT 2012 coming out now, that trend will continue and there'll be lots of people downloading MDT 2012 and using it to deploy Windows 7, and as we move forward, Windows 8 as well. So for today's session, we want to talk about MDT 2012. If you've already downloaded it, obviously you know that it already shipped. That happened earlier this week, finally. So we've got that one out of the way, and we're just going to run through and talk about all the new features, all the changes from the previous release. So it's not so much an introduction to MDT session or anything like that. We're just going to focus on the changes from the previous release. There were introductory sessions earlier in the week, so hopefully you check those out too. So it was a long process that we went through. 3 beta releases going back as far as June 2011. We finally released in April. It is available for download on the Download Center. If you still have any feedback to submit, we will be creating new versions of it as we're going forward. So you can still go out to the Connect website and submit any feedback that you have. We'll still process that and take it into account for the next releases. So, as usual, we'll break this down into a few different areas. We have new features in each of the 3 main scenarios. Light touch installation without Config Manager, zero touch installation with Config Manager 2007 or 2012, and user-driven installation, also with CM07 and CM12. So we provided new features in each of those areas. We'll go through those each as we're going through the session. And as before, the upgrade process, if you're running MDT 2010 today, is pretty much install the new version over the top of it. And in the case of light touch, that automatically upgrades your existing deployment shares. In the case of Config Manager, we would suggest that you create new task sequences with a new toolkit package and then migrate your customizations into those new task sequences. If you're using Config Manager integrated task sequences, the existing MDT 2010 task sequences would continue to work even after you've installed MDT 2012, but it would be using the existing toolkit package. It wouldn't be using the MDT 2012 toolkit package. That's something we don't test. We don't test going into an existing task sequence and changing it to use a different set of scripts. Might work, might not. We would always suggest creating the new task sequence with the new toolkit package and use those together. So let's dive in then to light touch. Now, the main focus for this release was to add support for System Center 2012. Still, we ended up adding a lot of things to light touch. First on the list, new monitoring capabilities. We wanted to provide the ability for an administrator sitting at their deployment workbench to be able to see what deployments were currently going on for a deployment share. So we've added an option where you can go into the deployment share properties, check a box to say I want to enable monitoring, and now all the client machines will check back into the server to report progress, which lets you see at a glance what's going on inside of your deployment environment. We've also integrated that in with another piece that we'll talk about. The diagnostics and recovery toolkit tools have been integrated into MDT so that we can put those into the MDT boot images and then tie those into the monitoring piece so that you can get into MDT and say, I want to remote control that machine even though it's currently in Windows PE. So we'll take a look at that one and see what that integration looks like. You also get all the other Dart tools integrated at that point in time when you do that integration, so that you can use like the Explorer and Registry Editor and Locksmith and other tools that are provided as part of Dart as well. It does require that you have Dart separately. We don't ship Dart with MDT. Dart's still a component of the Desktop Optimization Pack, MDOP, so you would need to license MDOP in order to get Dart. Once you have that, it's a fairly easy process of dropping the files in place for MDT to find and then enable it in the deployment share properties, and then we'll do the rest to integrate it into the boot images. We also integrated the Security Compliance Manager. How many of you have ever used SCM? Not quite as large of a number. It's another solution accelerator from our team that's designed to let you define the security baselines for your operating systems. So it ships with a set of default baselines that have the recommended security settings for an enterprise deployment of Windows. So we've integrated those baselines into MDT, into our default task sequences, to automatically apply those baselines to the computer as part of either the image creation process or the deployment process. That'll tighten the security on the operating system a little bit. No drastic changes beyond what the default installation options are, but there are a few tweaks that you might run into, especially if you're using some non-Windows file servers to host any content. There are some specific security settings that are in there that can interfere with that process, but for the most part, these security settings are going to just take you to the recommended level from both government and non-government systems. So we have the templates in there for the latest service packs of the supported operating system, Windows 7, Windows Vista, Windows XP, and really you don't need to do anything beyond that. If you wanted to, you could put in your own custom security template. You could go into SCM, you could customize the templates that are provided, you could export them as a GPO pack, place the GPO pack in place for MDT to use, set a task sequence variable, and tell us here's the one we want you to use instead of the default one. So we provided that integrated in just to show you how to integrate SCM into the deployment process. We've also done some work around Windows RE so that we can expose Windows RE through the boot image. So in the initial welcome wizard, if the Windows RE components are there, we'll show them. But we've also added another option to say, I want to take that Windows RE boot image or the light touch boot image, if that's all you have, and stage it to the hard drive. So if the machine breaks for some reason or blue screens 3 times in a row or whatever happens to it, you can boot into Windows PE running from the hard drive, get into the Dart tools if you have Dart integration in place, and otherwise run the light touch wizard, connect back to a deployment share, and reinstall the OS if that's the last resort option at that point. So we provide that option, set a task sequence variable. We'll take care of doing that then automatically. The nice thing about that is the image that we're placing onto the hard drive is basically the normal light touch PE WIM file. So it has all the drivers integrated into it, all the pieces that you need for that to be a functional Windows RE boot image without needing to do anything else to it. We've also added support for deploy to VHD, which needs a little bit of explanation. The basic process that we go through when we're deploying an operating system has been to format and partition the disk and then run setup.exe and tell it to apply the operating system to that disk. Windows 7 added support for booting from a VHD. So we've had to modify the process to be able to run the operating system from a VHD file instead of from the disk directly. So a lot of people would think, well, when we added deploy to VHD support to MDT, that now means we're going to deploy VHD files. Not really. We're going to still have WIM files for our operating system images, but when you deploy using the new deploy to VHD task sequence templates, we will format and partition the physical disk, then create a VHD on that physical disk, format and partition that, and then deploy the operating system into that empty VHD. Now, that might not seem completely logical, but it's very efficient because VHD files tend to be very large. WIM files are very compressed. So by doing the on-the-fly creation of the VHD, we can avoid moving around 10 to 20 gig VHD files and instead just be dealing with the 2 to 5 gig WIM files that you would tend to already have in place. So using that, you can deploy an operating system to the machine running from a VHD, booting from that VHD. So this really has nothing to do with virtualization or anything like that. It's just about doing boot from VHD for your existing images. At this point, we only support that for bare metal deployments. It doesn't work for situations where you might want to preserve the existing OS to do, say, a dual boot configuration. Maybe you have Windows 7 running from the hard drive and Windows 8 running from a VHD. You can tweak the task sequences to enable that, but out of the box, they're designed just to do a bare metal deployment to a VHD. That's something we'll look at addressing for a future release to provide that non-destructive VHD deployment. So I can leave what I've currently got on the hard drive and just add a new OS to it. We've also added support for deploying to UEFI computers. How many of you are familiar with UEFI? I've done sessions in the past where we've spent 75 minutes talking about UEFI and why it's changed and why it's important and all that kind of stuff. Today we had to give you the 60-second version of that. So basically, it's a replacement for the existing legacy BIOS that's been running on PCs since they were created. Its primary benefits are that it initializes faster, it supports larger boot drives, it gets you away from all of that legacy 16-bit PC underpinnings and just gets it to a very modern environment that can support more advanced features. So that support was added in Windows 7. It gets enhanced in Windows 8 to add additional features like secure boot. You've probably seen the articles talking about that. So it's important for us to be able to support UEFI in MDT to be able to deploy to those machines natively. Most of you probably have machines already that support UEFI, but they also include a compatibility module that allows them to emulate the BIOS modes from PCs of the past. So in order to do a UEFI deployment, you would need to flip a switch in the BIOS to say, expose the UEFI functionality, and then there are some other steps that you would need to go through to make sure that the computer actually boots into UEFI to do the deployment like that. The biggest difference that you would see from a deployment perspective is UEFI will always create a GPT disk. Today, when you deploy an OS, you never deploy it to a GPT disk. GPT can only be used with UEFI. You would use an MBR disk if you're not using UEFI. So you'll see a different partition structure and a different disk format when you do this type of deployment. So a lot of people have said, well, I have a UEFI machine. I'm going to do a UEFI deployment to it. I did the deployment. I don't see any difference. I still see an MBR disk. I still see the standard partition structure. You didn't then do a UEFI deployment because if you did one, you would see 3 partitions, with the first being a FAT32 EFI partition, the second one being an MSR reserve partition, the third being the operating system. It can be really tricky sometimes with these machines to actually get them to boot into UEFI. They try to hide that because most end users never want to see that. Enterprises, though, as we move forward, as we get to Windows 8, that'll be much more important. So study up on it, experiment with it in your lab, start getting familiar with it. As we move forward over the next few years, we'll probably get to a point where PCs support nothing but UEFI. So today, most machines have the legacy BIOS fallback. That won't be the case in the future. We've also added support for a couple of additional operating systems, Windows Thin PC and Windows POS Ready 7. How many of you are familiar with Windows Thin PC? A few people. It is basically a stripped-down version of Windows 7 designed to run as a thin client operating system. It can be installed on machines with less RAM, with less disk space, and then be used to connect to a virtualization environment of some type. Citrix, VDI, whatever your backend happens to be, you use this Thin PC operating system as the way to get to that environment. It's about 60% of the size of Windows 7. It's effectively looks just like Windows 7 when you install it. The only difference is that it includes Internet Explorer, it includes the remote desktop client, and that's pretty much about it. You just use the remote services for everything else. So we can deploy that. It deploys just like Windows 7, very easy to do. If you have software assurance, it's provided as a feature of software assurance. You can make use of it in your environment. POS-Ready 7 is a little different. It's designed for point-of-sale systems. How many of you are using POS-Ready today? 1, 2, 3. So it's very much specialized compared to some of the other operating systems that we support, but it is available via volume licensing. So as a result, we wanted to support all volume license operating systems. Fortunately, POS-Ready installs just like ThinPC, which installs pretty much just like Windows 7. So very easy for us to add that support. The only real changes that we needed to make to support ThinPC and POS-Ready 7 was to remove one entry from the unattend.xml to say upgrade equals no, because POS-Ready and Windows ThinPC can't be upgraded. So the setting, even though we set it to no by default, isn't valid for those OSs, so we had to remove that for those OSs. Easy enough, then it's just a question of testing. We've also enhanced the light touch wizards. So if you're familiar with the wizards that we had in the past, they were kind of Vista-style wizards. They were white background, blue text, highlighted bars at the top, smaller text in the middle. Pretty plain looking because they were designed to mimic the Windows Vista wizards, which were also pretty plain looking. Well, everyone complained that they were ugly. Okay, so let's try to make them prettier. So now the wizards that we have in Light Touch and in Config Manager follow the System Center UI guidelines of how wizards should look, feel, behave. So you'll see that as we're going through the demos, that the look and feel has changed. We've provided additional functionality as part of that as well. We've then provided some additional support inside of the task sequence for running PowerShell scripts to try to integrate PowerShell scripts better into the task sequence itself. Now, with the existing MDT, you can run PowerShell.exe and run your scripts in there just fine. So this is about trying to take it that next level. Let's provide something that takes care of execution policies, that takes care of integrating the logging from the PowerShell scripts with the logging that comes from the rest of the BDD scripts. Let's provide something that allows you to interact with the task sequence environment, setting task sequence variables from PowerShell, retrieving task sequence variables from PowerShell. We'll integrate with the progress UI for the task sequence. So if you have a PowerShell script that wants to report progress back to the user, we'll automatically display that as well. So it's all about trying to make it easier to put these PowerShell scripts into your task sequence just by saying, I want to add a run PowerShell script step, specify the script name, specify any parameters you want to pass into that, and we'll take care of the rest behind the scenes. We've also done the initial work necessary to deploy Windows 8. Windows 8 includes a new set of deployment tools. You used to have the Windows AIK as the required component that MDT used to deploy Windows. ADK, the Assessment and Deployment Kit, is the new version of that to support Windows 8 deployment. So now at this point, MDT 2012 can support using Windows AIK or using Windows ADK. Windows ADK would be used in the lab at this point because it's just beta at this phase. So we'll take a look at some of these as we're going through. Windows 8 and the ADK side, not so much this time around. You can try it out in your labs, test it out, see how all that works. As we move forward and move closer to the Windows 8 release, we'll have more functionality, additional releases to fully support all the Windows 8 features that are coming. So that's kind of the visible side, the things that you would see inside of MDT as you're using Deployment Workbench, as you're doing light touch deployments. There are also, though, a lot of behind-the-scenes changes that we needed to do to either fix up problems that we've had in the past or prepare for new operating system functionality coming down the line. So we've done a significant amount of work related to partitioning logic, just to make sure that we properly handle the way a disk is partitioned and how we deploy a new OS to an existing partition structure. A lot of you had complained with MDT 2010 that we would put the boot partition at the end of the disk and the operating system at the beginning, when the recommendation was to do it the opposite way, with the boot partition at the beginning and OS at the end. So we had to adjust our logic to do that. We made adjustments to the user state migration process, really just to clean things up and get us ready to support 3 different versions of USMT. USMT 3 for Windows XP, USMT 4 for Vista and Windows 7, USMT 5 for Windows 8. So we put a lot of work into the scripts for that. We went through every script in MDT that has a long-running operation and made sure that it displays progress as it's going along. Like when you're capturing an image, we don't just say capturing WIM. We can actually show you that we're 10% of the way, 20% of the way, 30% of the way. Same with injecting drivers, installing applications, performing multicast transmissions. Anything that we do that will take a while, we wanted to make sure that we could display progress to show you what's going on. We also added support for cross-platform deployments. So if you wanted to only use Windows x86, Windows PE x86 boot images, we'll support that for deploying x64 OSs. So now if you boot into a light touch x86 PE image, you'll see both x86 and x64 task sequences and be able to choose either one. We've tied into that some changes to the way we find the setup files to install the operating system. A lot of you have probably seen situations where you've got an error back from MDT that says, unable to find setup required to install the OS. And if you look through the troubleshooting docs, which apparently no one reads, it says when you import your OS, there needs to be at least one version of the setup files on the deployment share, because MDT always uses setup to install the OS. So a lot of people got used to that, but now when you get into this cross-platform world, that means when you're deploying an x64 OS, there needs to be an x86 set of setup files available. So we expected to start getting a lot more phone calls, a lot more questions from people saying, what does this error mean? That we documented in 3 or 4 different places in the documentation to explain how to do this. So rather than having to deal with all the phone calls and emails from people trying to figure this out, we added fallback logic into the scripts to say anytime we can't find setup, that's okay. We're going to just apply the image directly using ImageX. We're going to do all the work that setup would have done. We're just going to do it directly in the MDT scripts. That's the fallback logic at this point in MDT 2012. As we move forward to the next release, that'll be the default. We'll stop using setup for most situations as we move forward. The only exception would be Windows Vista installations would continue to use setup. But setup is being slowly phased out just so that we can control the process better just using ImageX. We've also changed a lot around cleanup. So if you're doing a deployment, let's say you're installing an operating system and you find out that you're missing a network driver. You're probably doing this in your lab. You see that you get an error that it can't connect to the deployment share. Okay, I need to fix that. Turn the machine off. I'll go over to the server. I'll add the network driver, update my boot images, and then come back and try again. The challenge was there would be an in-progress task sequence on the hard drive of the computer, and that would interfere with the next deployment process. So you would boot up, you'd try to select a task sequence, and instead it would just go off and try to do something else. We've added logic now to be able to keep track of the state of the machine, and anytime we find it in a state we don't expect, we'll put up a dialog to say, we found a dirty environment. What would you like for us to do? Would you like us to clean it off and start new, or would you like us to try to continue when we don't really know what's going to happen because we don't know how we got into this state? That should address most of these issues. We have seen a few people that have said, hey, that's causing me some issues because I'm seeing this all the time. Those problems, as we've investigated them, have been happening because people have task sequence steps that reboot out from under the task sequencer, which isn't something that should ever happen. It just happened to work in the past with MDT 2010. With 2012 and this cleanup logic change that we've made, we'll now see that as a dirty environment and prompt to say, hey, something didn't go right. The machine rebooted out from under us. We don't know what happened. We don't know what state we're in. Would you like us to clean it off or continue? So you may see that in situations where you're installing apps that don't properly suppress reboots. The solution would be to suppress those reboots to make sure you only do controlled reboots out of the task sequence. We also added an option to make it easier to create VM templates. How many of you are using Hyper-V or VMware or something that requires a base VM VHD file? Quite a few of you. MDT can easily be used to create those base VHDs. But the typical process that you would want to use for that is install the OS, customize it, patch it, do whatever configuration is necessary, sysprep it, and shut it down. Once the virtual machine has been sysprepped and shut down, it's effectively now ready to be imported as a template into Hyper-V, into VMM, so that you're ready to use that for creating future virtual machines. The challenge that you had with MDT 2010 was the one option you needed, sysprep and shut down, wasn't available. So we added sysprep and shutdown as an option into the build process just to make this easier to do. So let me switch it over to Ben, and we'll run through what a lot of those enhancements look like.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I also have the same problem as Mike. My voice is going as well. I don't normally talk as much as I do this week. So the first thing Mike mentioned was those dirty environments. So I'm going to show you the wizard and the changes that have been made now, but the first thing I'll show you is the dirty environment here. This is probably one of my favorite features. It's very simple, but it's definitely one of my favorites, particularly when you're building MDT task sequences and testing and rebooting. And before, you would have had the mini NT folder sitting there getting in the way and causing you problems, and sometimes you wouldn't know what was causing those problems. So now you'll see this. You can either click no and be brave, or you can click yes, and it will clean off all the folders and start again from scratch. So let's click yes there, and we'll start up the wizard. You'll notice it's looking a bit more shiny and pretty, as Mike calls it. And so at this stage, you'll see this is a different screen. We have different options here. We've got this Run Dart tool. So I've integrated Dart, which is a simple process of just getting the cab files that come with Dart and dropping them into the tools and their matching architecture folder in the MDT structure. And then you can automatically integrate it. It's probably a 2-minute job, so it's very easy. So if we go down here and click Run Dart Tools, you can boot up and then run these tools. So you've got things like we could have a registry editor and do our registry editing here if you're testing, or wipe the disk. All those kind of things are here. And we also have this one, remote control, or remote connection. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So you can see you've got access to those tools. And let's go into the wizard itself. So here I've got some sample task sequences. I'll perhaps build an image here. You'll notice that we have the different panes. We've got the standard system center style. And we can go through and do the standard tasks. Although these panes have changed, we've restructured the way the wizard is laid out. Before, you would have one pane that asked you for the computer name, then you'd go to the next one and it would ask you for domain details. Now we've tried to combine those panes to reduce the overall number. You can still hide the overall pane or hide a section of the pane. So for example, if you want to do skip domain membership, it will hide that part, but you will still see the computer name. So you can still have the same type of functionality you had before, but hopefully it's a nicer, more clean wizard. If we go through again, I'll skip down a couple of panes because this really doesn't change a lot, and go to capture image. So this is much the same. We can sysprep and so on. Now I'm going to switch back. So down here, if we have a look, we have this. So this is the Dart remote connection utility. If you use Dart at the moment and you do have it integrated with WinPE, what you have to do is talk to the user and sort of point out that there's this little box down in the bottom corner and to open it up and get them to read you out this information. So if you want a remote control into WinPE, where there's often problems, I refer to it as sort of the black hole of deployment. The deployment starts if you're if you're on another site, you don't know what's happening until you get into the OS. You can get logs sent up, that kind of stuff, but you can't control it. So we this black hole doesn't exist anymore. So there's this information, and what we do is we take that information and via a web service, we pass it back to our server. So let me click here and I'll just refresh that. So now here, we can see the machine we're running, open it up, and it will show us how many errors we've got, what step we're at. We've not actually started the deployment process yet, so it doesn't show us the step. But it will say things like deploying this application, or it's just laying out the steps that are in the task sequence. So you can see your progress. Now we also have at the moment we have two, remote desktop. So if we were in the full OS and remote desktop was enabled, you could click that and connect to remote desktop. There's one missing in the middle here. If you had an OS that had the integration components for Hyper-V, a button will appear there and you can connect directly into that as well, into the remote control for the VM session, and you have Dart remote control. So I'll click this. This will take a few seconds to start. A few more seconds. And now we have remote control of the machine. So you can go and perform all the kind of tasks that you want to do. To me, that's pretty cool. It certainly means that there's a point now that that's caused you problems before that you can deal with. So if you don't have Dart, you will still have access to the other two, but you won't get that WinPE access. Okay, what do you think of that, guys? Like it? Okay, so anything else you want to add there? Monitoring mic I've missed? No? Okay, let me switch this to give us a little bit more screen real estate here. Okay, so another feature I want to show you is the PowerShell side of things. As Mike said before, you can run PowerShell. It was great, but there wasn't the integration. Like when I build scripts in MDT, I want to get all that logging information. I want to use the task sequence variables and those variables that are available from MDT in my VB scripts. But I couldn't do that with PowerShell before. So now I've got a task sequence here. I've just created a standard task sequence. We'll have a look in here. Let that start. So we've got a standard task sequence, and all I'm going to do here is run a PowerShell script, that's all. This is the first time I've opened it, so it takes a few seconds to bring it up. There we go. There's a lot in here for it to display. So this is pretty simple. All I did was go add, run PowerShell script. That's it. And then I'm referring to my script. There's no signing enabled. I've not decided, my execution policy is I've not touched it. So we've got script root. I'm pointing to a simple script. So if we have a look at that script, here, it's a pretty simple script. I'm importing the ZTI utility PowerShell module. Write host, here we are, we're writing to the host. This will go into our BDD logging environment by using write host. We import server manager here as well as an example. Then we get the modules, and we're going to list out the environment variables from our task sequence. So this will give us all the variables. And then we've got a sample here of just displaying progress. So, the bar will move along. And that's about it. So let me just show you that script. Generally, I don't recommend running your deployments on the server, but for this case, it's good. Okay, so let's go to testing PowerShell, ask for the password, and then we'll begin. So what you'll see here is we're launching the script. It's just setting up the environment in the background, and then we're going to see progress moving along. We'll give that a moment for it to do all the process of gather and so on in the background. I'll pop that up there. There we go. So now, this is all I've done is just a quick sleep, but displayed progress. What I want to show there is that you can display progress and those kind of things from within PowerShell. So there we go, we're finished. I'm not going to close that just for the moment, but what I want to do is open up the browser here and I'll show you the logs. So I go to mini-nt, SMS, OSD, OSD logs, and there's nothing there. So as part of the improved cleanup stuff we've done, when that screen comes up, everything's gone. So when this screen here is there, we've cleaned out all of the environment. So now if you have a deployment and it's finished and somebody just shuts the machine down at the end, that won't leave a mess on the machine. It's cleaned up. So for some people, when you're testing, I know a lot of people, what they do is they stand up an environment, they run through and something fails, an app install fails, for example. They'll then just leave it in the background and keep rerunning their scripts or their tests. That won't work anymore. What you will need to do is do something similar to the sample task sequence I did here for PowerShell, but to install and test your apps. So let's show you where it did go. So if we go here, it's now Windows temp deployment logs, our standard place where we put this kind of thing. You will see there's a test log here, which is the script that we just ran. You'll see it's collected all the environment variables and all this kind of stuff in the standard NDT way. So if you want to use PowerShell in this way, this is all in bdd.log as well. So it's pretty powerful, and that was a pretty small script that's gone and got all of this information, all of the variables, listed everything out, including, if you want to, the System Center variables as you're running, if you're running this in System Center 2012, for example. So that's a really simple script, but you can see how powerful it could be.
How many of you also noticed that after that task sequence finished, that the summary wizard showed up immediately?
Oh, yes.
If you were to do something like that in MDT 2010, it would be almost exactly 60 seconds before that dialog would show up. There was a problem in the task sequencing engine with the cleanup that it was trying to do in the log files, that was trying to remove a log file that was actually in use because it was in use by the task sequencing engine. So it would try for 60 seconds to do that cleanup logic, and in that time, you wanted to know what was going on because the screen was blank, you couldn't see any activity, and then the summary wizard would show up to say that we're done. That problem's been fixed. We have a hot fix into the task sequence engine that removes that 60-second delay. So now the success summary wizard will pop up immediately after the task sequence completes.
Or the failure summary wizard.
Or the failure.
Okay, so we'll switch back.
Okay, so now let's shift over to Configuration Manager and zero-touch installation. Obviously, the biggest item that we needed to do was add support for System Center 2012. The integrations that MDT does with Config Manager are tied into the Config Manager console. The Config Manager console in Config Manager 2012 has been rewritten. So we needed to adjust all of our integrations to make sure that they would run in the new version. So that was the first #1 task. But then we also needed to add support for the new Config Manager 2012 functionality. Things like being able to install applications, the apps that are defined as part of the new app model, inside of a task sequence. So we've added steps in there to handle that. We needed to be able to configure user device affinity as part of the task sequence so that the primary user could be established before the user even logs on for the first time. We needed to add support for new pre-execution commands that you can hook into the boot image, which are a little more convenient than the previous versions because you can separate the scripts and extra content from the boot image itself. So we've done all of these different behind-the-scenes changes to make sure that Config Manager 2012 works, providing all the existing functionality that we had for Config Manager 2007, but then also takes into account all of the new Config Manager 2012 OSD functionality. Now, that doesn't mean that we're dropping support for Config Manager 2007. It's still in there. It provides all the same functionality that you had before, plus a lot of the enhancements that we already talked about for light touch, like PowerShell support. You can use that either in 2007 or 2012. So we do have PowerShell in the task sequence, and like on the light touch side, a lot of behind-the-scenes improvements. On the partitioning side, with MDT 2010, if you created a config manager task sequence using MDT, that would by default create a single partition, regardless of the operating system that you were deploying, which isn't a recommended configuration again. If you're deploying Windows 7, you should be creating two partitions, a boot partition and an OS partition. So we've updated the task sequences to always create that appropriate partition structure when you're doing a bare metal deployment. That was the easy part. We looked at that and said, yeah, no problem. We can put in the steps to create the appropriate partition structure based on the OS that we're deploying. On XP, create one. On Vista, create a 2 gig and then use the rest for the OS. For Windows 7, create a 512 meg one and then use the rest for the OS. No problem. Then we started trying to do refreshes, and everything kind of crumbled because you then had to deal with the situation of where is the current OS? So I could have a XP machine that I'm trying to refresh to Windows 7 that has a single partition. I could have a Vista machine that I'm trying to refresh to Windows 7 that has the boot partition at the end. I could have a new MDT 2012 built machine that has the boot partition at the beginning. So it might be disk 0 partition 1, disk 0 partition 2. It could be disk 0 partition 3. We wanted to make sure that regardless of where the current OS is, that when we refresh it, the new OS goes to the same place without needing to edit the task sequence to tell it specifically, here's where I want it to go. Because it's not that simple anymore. There are different partition structures. You always want the new OS to go where the old OS was. So we've made sure that the logic in the task sequence handles that well. We've also made enhancements to the user state migration process with Config Manager as well. In the UDI case, a lot of the functionality is shared between UDI and Light Touch as far as user state migration goes. So the script changes that we made there also apply to UDI. But even for scenarios like I know John has tried to do, where you wanted to do state migration without using an SMP, we had issues doing that in the past because we expected if you wanted to capture to the network, you're going to use a state migration point. We don't make that assumption anymore. If you've set the OSD state store path to point to a network location, we'll see that and say, oh, okay, you want to use that UNC. We won't request an SMP location. We'll just go ahead and write the state to the location that you provided for us. We also made some changes in the refresh case where we don't put the state folder inside of the _SMS task sequence folder anymore. There were some scenarios where if there was a specific type of task sequence failure, we wouldn't be able to get the user state folder moved out of there before it got cleaned up. So you could have a situation where we backed up the user state into the folder. We then booted into Windows PE, wiped the existing OS, went to install the new OS, tried to boot into the new OS, ran into a failure, and then it deleted the user state before it had restored it. That's not good because now your user state is gone. So we wanted to make sure that we followed the suggestions from the Config Manager CSS team to say, yeah, don't do it that way. Get the user state out of that temporary folder so that if these types of failures happen, which are fairly rare, that we don't end up deleting the user state. So you'll see as part of the deployment process now, the state will typically end up in /state store. The location itself doesn't matter just as long as it's not inside of the mini-nt or _SMS task sequence folders. So we had to make those adjustments. Just like in Light Touch, we've also added progress displays in Config Manager for any operations that we're doing that take a long time. Things like the gather process and offline patching, language pack installation, all of those will display progress as well now. And we started to make the changes necessary to support Windows 8 and the 80K. Now, to truly get full Windows 8 support with Config Manager 2012, we need to wait for a future version of Config Manager that will add support for that. So don't assume that this means you can go out and deploy Windows 8 using Config Manager 2012 and MDT 2012. Now we've just started doing some of the behind-the-scenes work to get ready for that so that when the future release is ready, we'll be able to add this much more easily. So let's take a tour of those enhancements.
Okay, there we go, my mic's on. Okay, the first thing I want to do is just run you through the updated process for creating a task sequence. So really a lot of this is not that much different. We've tried to keep the experience as similar as possible. There are changes underneath the surface and some changes in the wizard itself or in the creation of the MDT task sequence, but really it's mostly the same. So if we start here, we choose our template. You can see the standard sort of templates here with UDI as well as the standard client task sequences. If I click next, we'll give this a name. The same sort of functionality here as you've seen before, the join domain and general details about the organization and so on. We have the capture settings here. Now with boot images, there are some changes, so we'll create one here. We'll go next. We can select the components we need. And then finally we go to customization. Here we can add we have the pre-start hook. So if you want to add things on the front of your media like wizards, those kind of things, you can use this. You can add extra files and so on. And then one extra thing we've added here is we enable that F8 support, which I tend to do by default all the time. Some customers don't like doing that. They don't want their users to be able to press F8. So you can remove it if you want, but by default, we're going to turn F8 on your MDT boot images. This is a great troubleshooting tool, and usually I forget about it. I do my first deployment, it blows up in some way because I've forgotten to do something, and I go to press F8 and it's not there. So now you won't have to deal with that. Anything else you want to add on that one, Mike? No? Okay. So then we'll go through and create our MDT package. I'll actually use an existing one. We use an existing OS image. So the thing I like about this wizard, for those of you who have not been using MDT so much, is this stuff, all these steps. If you don't have the wizard, you've got to do this manually. You've got to go through and create all of these packages. So this really takes a lot of the effort away from building and deploying with Config Manager. We've got USMT, we'll specify our USMT files. And so on. And we go through the wizard. So settings, I'll use an existing one. And so on. So really there's not a lot of change in there, and that, I guess, is the main point of this demonstration. Other than that F8 that I showed you, there's really not a lot of change through this wizard. So if you know what you're doing, and if you've done it with MDT 2010 and Config Manager, you'll have no problems running through this. So we have tried, and the whole thing with this is we try and obscure all the complexity. Not obscure, but you don't need to deal with that so much. So the wizard is really making your life a lot easier.
There is one other change that you might see on this screen if you're doing server deployment especially. There's an OS image index wizard pane that will only show up if you select an OS image that contains multiple WIMs. So in that case, in the past with MDT 2010, we would just assume that we're going to deploy the first image. So if you wanted to deploy image 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you would have to go in later, edit the task sequence, and change it to use the different image index. But now if we see that there are multiple images, we'll ask you, well, which one do you want to use? So you may see that pane show up if you have multi-image WIMs going forward.
Yep. Okay, so I'll cancel out of that, because if I press yes, it'll go away and create it. And we'll just look at an existing task sequence I've created. So let's edit this. This is all pretty much standard. There are some different disk formatting and partitioning options here, but other than that, mostly it's the same. If we scroll down and we come down to applications, we'll show adding a Config Manager application. So not a package, but an app. So this is a simple but important thing. You can go in here, you can browse all the apps that are available to be deployed via a task sequence. Here we have the app that you must have, otherwise your deployment will not be successful. And so we've got an Angry Birds app that we've packaged. Nice, simple one, but it is really that simple. So you can go through, just add it in, arrange the apps, or however you want to do it. It's a simple process, and you have all the things. It's just like adding a package. Anything else there? It's really, there's,
Yeah,
in
it's
a way,
pretty
there's
simple.
not a lot to say.
They've addressed a lot of the limitations that you would run into with packages with CM07. Things like following dependency chains are now really easy. You install the app via the task sequence. If it has any dependencies, it installs those too.
Yep.
It will respect all the deployment types and go through the evaluation process of figuring out which deployment type to install. So really nice integration between task sequences and the new app model. In the case of MDT, if you're doing dynamic package installation, now dynamic application installation is enabled as well. The only difference are the next two steps in the task sequence there. It wants a 2-digit list instead of a 3-digit list. MDT does 3-digit lists, so we had to do some logic to convert the two. So you might wonder, well, what exactly is that step doing? Well, that's its sole purpose is to convert a 3-digit list to a 2-digit list, and then it passes that on to the install app step. Other than that, if you were to compare an MDT 2012 created task sequence in Config Manager 2012 against one created in Config Manager 2007, the only difference would be that install applications folder doesn't exist in a CM07 task sequence. So we actually used the same task sequence template for both versions, for CM07 and CM12, but when we import it into CM07, we delete that one folder. So very similar between the two. The OS deployment capabilities between the versions are very much in sync, which enables us to use a single template.
So hopefully you'll feel comfortable. The one other difference, which is not at all related to MDT, is this button, Distribute Content. This is my all-time favorite feature in Config Manager 2012, because I know when I build up that task sequence, MDT creates all the packages for you to do the deployment, the boot images, all those kind of things. You then have to go through and find all of them and get them out to your distribution points, and you'd invariably miss something. You know, that's why I needed F8 with 2007, because I always missed one. And so the Distribute Content button will just distribute all of the packages for you for that. To me, that is damn cool. But I'm easily pleased. So.
I had posted a PowerShell script for CM07 to do that process, to look at all your task sequences, look at the packages that they reference, and add them to the distribution points to avoid those types of things. So I've started getting emails from people asking, well, where's the CM12 version of that PowerShell script? You don't need it anymore. It's been replaced by a very nice wizard.
Yeah. Okay.
Next on the list, user-driven installation. For those of you who aren't familiar with UDI, it was a new scenario added in MDT 2010 Update 1 to provide kind of the light touch experience in a config manager task sequence, to display a wizard at the beginning of the process to allow the user to make choices about the deployment. Things like what application should be installed, what's the computer name, the same types of settings you would specify in the light touch wizard. Now integrated into Config Manager, it shows up as part of the initial steps of the task sequence. That's been reworked for MDT 2012. First, to add support for Config Manager 2012, that's a given, but also much more extensive changes have been made behind the scenes to provide a new UDI designer for configuring the wizard and a new wizard itself with additional panes for BitLocker, for configuring user device affinity, a new wizard to do the replace scenario where I want to back up the user state from one computer to a network share or a USB key. We talked about the non-SMP scenario. Basically, UDI will use that by default. And then the corresponding changes on the new computer side to ask, is there any user state that you want to restore from another machine? So that's been integrated in as well. One of the complaints with the previous version was around extensibility, that if you wanted to add your own wizard pages to the UDI wizard, there wasn't any option to do that. With the new version, there is an SDK provided, so for the developer types in the room, you can create the C++ code necessary to add an additional wizard pane and add that into the process. Related to that, some people have said they'd like to localize the wizard to provide support for additional languages. We don't provide any additional language support out of the box, but you can use localization tools to take the UDI wizard and convert it into, say, French or Spanish or some other language using those types of tools. So we've enabled that. We've made sure that that will work. We just don't provide the localized versions by default. On the light touch side, that was never really an issue because we provide the light touch wizard as a set of XML files, and you can go in and edit them and change them however you want. But with UDI, it was always a much more difficult process. Now it's exposed through the SDK so that you can do those types of manipulations. Just like with zero-touch scenarios, we've added PowerShell support. Not a big surprise that there's a lot in common between ZTI and UDI scenarios. So all of those same behind-the-scenes improvements that we talked about before for ZTI also apply to UDI. So let's look at the new UDI.
Okay, as Mike mentioned, with UDI, I guess the key component of designing the wizard is the UDI designer, so UDI wizard designer. Now, as we go through this, let me just size it appropriately. This is the first view you're presented. There's some simple steps here as to how to get started with building the configuration file that the UDI wizard uses. So if we dive in here, we'll create a new configuration. Now the first thing you're going to see is a couple of panes. The first one is a page library. These are the default pages that UDI provides for you to build up a wizard flow. On this side here is the actual flows that you're building for the wizard. So here they've got 3 stages, as we call them, stage groups. The first is new computer, which matches to the new computer scenario, a refresh scenario, wizard flows, and then replace. So what I'll do is we'll just expand this. So I'll remove this. By default, you'll see this view. These are just like sample pictures. They're not live updated. Some people will say, I've changed it and this doesn't change. They're just a screenshot, so you get an idea of what it will look like. I'll hide those because I know what they look like and it's easy to view it here. If we have a look in the other panes, I'll just expand these, you'll see there are different wizard panes depending on what you want to do. So for example, if we're doing a replace scenario and we're doing it within WinPE, we just want to get the machine, suck off the user state, and then put it somewhere. So the wizard's going to be quite short. If we want to do a full new computer scenario up here, the wizard's obviously going to be longer. We're going to want to have our welcome screen. We're going to want to ask about BitLocker and administration passwords, all those kind of things. So let me dive into the most simple page here. What you'll see is this layout. This is the text you can change, so you can go and change all the text that appears in the wizard to what you want it to be. There's sample text here, but you'll definitely want to change that. They also include a screenshot, which is also just a screenshot, so you can look and work out what it might look like. So I could go through and change my text there. I won't bother with this. I'll go back to the flow. I want to show you a couple of different pages first. So the first is the new computer details. Now, once again, we have the screenshot like you saw. We can expand the pane. So this is for each sort of field that you see, there's a pane. So I can expand this pane, I can give a default value, I can use task sequence variables and so on to populate what will appear for the users. I keep scrolling down here, I can use an existing name, and also on this page it's asking me for domain information. So let's have a go at populating the domain information. So if I go down here, I can add a domain. So of course this is contoso.com. And I'll go OK. So a key feature of this UDI wizard editor is the ability to go off to things and suck back the information. So in this case, I've got contoso.com. If I click on this, I can go up here and go search domain for OUs, and it will list all the OUs that are in the domain. So now I can select workstations or others and add them in. So it's removing the errors and those kind of things that you might have. So I can add this in. I can change how it's displayed and so on, but I can add multiple OUs, and the user will see this in the list. I can then, if I scroll up a little bit under here, I can specify what my defaults might be, whether it's domain, join, that kind of thing. So if we scroll back up and just have a look at that screenshot, you'll see I've configured, in this example, Redmond, we've got sample OUs, the computer might be populated and so on. So you can sort of get the feel of we're able to connect up and grab information. You build up how it's set up in these screens. So let me go back to the flow again and just show you a couple of other ones. This pane here is the installing software pane. So we go through the wizard. It's user-driven, so there's generally going to be some apps that they might want to select. So here we have a sample. It's set up with a sample. I'm going to remove that sample because I don't want that. What I want to do is I want to add some software to this group. You can choose whether you want it to be a package or an application. So I'll click Application. And then you can do a search. So I only have one app in here at the moment, Angry Birds again. And I'll add that in. It's populated the display name for us. You can change that if you want and hit Finish. Now we've got Angry Birds. I can have it pre-selected. If I tick it here, it'll be pre-selected in the wizard. But you can lay this out and build it up how you want it to be. Okay, so that was programs. That's fairly simple. Now there was one other one you mentioned, Mike, while we were... user state. Where's that? I wasn't going to show this, but since we're here... Where's the user state pane, Mike? I'm being blind, or is it off the edge of the pane?
Yeah, you're in your computer.
Of course, so you have to pay attention. So if we go to refresh, select target. So you could start defining what you're going to do with user state. So we can say restore locations. You can store your data on the network, or on a share, on a USB key, and within the wizard you can define where it's going to get it, what the defaults are, and so on. Or you can remove options as well. I will show one more thing. Deployment readiness. So what this does is they have a built-in series of checks that you can do when you're performing a deployment. Often you want to make sure the power's in, or that they're not connected to the network over wireless perhaps. Those kind of things. So you can add these checks, and it won't get past this phase in the wizard until we know we're powered on, that we've got the wizard check, that we have the right scripting host components on the box, particularly when we're doing a refresh and it's an old XP machine. So this machine is going to work with this deployment, and we're not going to have problems. So there are some standard default settings laid out there. So let me just skip out of here and go across to a machine that has the wizard ready to go. So I went through, I built that wizard template, I saved it into the MDT scripts folder on my MDT files package that's on Configuration Manager. So we have the wizard, you can edit this, we have a BitLocker pane, we can deal with we can do what we want to do here. Obviously this is a virtual machine, so we're not going to be able to do BitLocker. We can select the volume. So I didn't show this, but you can populate different images and so on. So we can drop down and select, I've only got one. We can select the volume we want to install on. There was some confusion around this, around how we display things. Because this is in WinPE, it's going to show D drive. When you're in the full OS, it will show C:. But what we've tried to do is put the OS disk label and the size of it to try and get around those areas where people aren't sure what disk they're actually looking at. And then where to capture user state and so on. I could click, I want to format the disk and so on if I want to do that. Next, we can select a target. I can select network. For this sample, I put a network backup location in the background as the location that would go to. It asks for a backup and so on. if I'm going to do this, it's going to ask for the user details to connect to that deployment share. I mean the user state location. Okay, there's the readiness side of things. If I didn't have these, it would have a red check mark there, and I could plug the device in, for example, and then hit retry and it will go through. Example, join the domain here. We can set account details, machine name, and so on. Here is the domain information that we populated before, there by default in the wizard. And so on. We go through. You can specify here if you want somebody to be an administrator on this box. You can do that by default. So say if you're doing a user-driven deployment and you just want the user to be an administrator. This is what we do within Microsoft because it's Microsoft people. But if you want to do that, you can have that there. Now, an interesting one here is user device affinity. You can specify a user here, and it will set up the affinity, so this is their primary device. Of course, you could hide this, so you could just say the person who gave their credentials earlier on in the wizard could be here, so they don't need to see this. So that's a cool feature as well. Languages, and then we can select our program to install, and then we can go through and begin our deployment. Now you can hide panes here as well if you want. Like we do need most of that information, but just like the NDT wizard, you can actually get rid of a pane, but you have to provide the information that pane would have needed via the custom settings.ini file or task sequence variables. So in the documentation, it will show you each pane and what information you need if you're going to skip it, because you're not necessarily going to want users to see all of these. Then I click finish and it will go along, and at the end you will see this screen. So they have a deployment summary that details what happened, welcome, and they click start Windows and it will go into the full OS. So there's lots of great features with UDI. So get in there, have a look at it, just play around with it. It's pretty easy. Like for me to set up this demo probably took me about 10 minutes. So it is simple. When you want to do things like add more pages down here, you do need a bit of development skills. As Mike said, you can build your own pages, but I couldn't do it. I'm not good enough at that, I would say. But if you have a friendly developer or someone around, or if you're good at it, then you can build your own as well. And there's a really good SDK, very comprehensive. So have a look at that if you want to know how to extend it. That's it for now.
So just to wrap up, if you're currently running a beta version of MDT 2012, we wouldn't suggest upgrading that to the final released version. It will probably work, but as we do continue to make changes to the task sequence templates up until the release, you wouldn't get the latest task sequence changes if you upgraded your existing MDT 2012 beta or RC deployment chairs to the released version. So what we would suggest is always go back to the original MDT 2010 Update 1 deployment chair and upgrade that to the final MDT 2012 release. If you're using Light Touch and have built OEM task sequences to do the OEM pre-staging of the media onto the hard drive, because of the partitioning logic changes that we made between MDT 2010 and 2012, you'll need to recreate those OEM task sequences. Fairly easy to do just because the task sequence is fairly simple. There's only like 7 or 8 steps in it, and you rarely customize that task sequence. So if you're using that, you'd want to delete your existing OEM staging task sequence and create a new one to do that staging. The actual deployment task sequence that runs isn't affected, so it's not like you're going to replace your entire client task sequence. You're just going to be changing the one that stages it onto the hard drive. Now, we've talked and mentioned a couple of times that MDT 2012 is out and Windows 8 is coming, and we're going to be doing additional work to support that. So do expect to see additional MDT releases throughout the year. Hopefully there'll be a fair amount of activity with those of you in the room downloading it, trying it out, providing feedback. We tend to get about 5,000 or so downloads for each beta version that we put out, and a good amount of feedback from the community telling us what they like, what they don't like, what they would like to see as far as features in the new version. So definitely keep that up and provide the feedback as these new releases come out. That is all we had to go through. According to the timer up here, we've got about 4 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, the mics are active, or speak loudly and we'll try to. Sure. Wait up front here for a sec. Go ahead.
I have only one question regarding the application or package support, especially if you have a big amount or great amount of application, 100 or whatever, over 1,000 applications, and we have the problem that we need all the metadata. We need the version, we need the language, we need the manufacturer to distinguish which application we have to choose in the wizard. In our problem, this information is somehow in STM, but not provided in the wizard.
So this is with the UDI deployment?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the comment was that selecting the applications, you had to get all the metadata in order to figure out which one you're actually selecting. Yeah, we'll have to look at that one. I know we've made changes in that with the new UDI designer to enable you to see more details. Yeah, but we'll have to revisit that and see what additional details that we can provide. But yeah, that tends to be a challenge when you have large lists of items, being able to find the right one, especially when you have Adobe Acrobat Reader, 6 different versions of it, and you want to choose a specific one.
But this is not possible right now. We cannot extend that.
No, that's within the designer itself, and that's not extensible.
Yeah.
Are the monitoring features and the Dart tools that you showed available in a SCCM integrated MDT solution? So can you...
That seems to be a question every time we talk about MDT 2012 and monitoring is, when can we do this with Config Manager? Today, we don't provide any direct support for that, although behind the scenes, a lot of it is possible. So in the case of adding the Dart tools into a MDT-generated boot image for Config Manager, that you can do, but we haven't really documented how. You would have to take the tools.cab files from Dart and drop them into a deployment share that's being used by MDT to create the boot images. Okay, in the Config Manager case, you aren't using a deployment share, so what does that mean? Where do you copy the files? Well, the wizard actually uses a template folder in C, Program Files, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, Templates, Distribution, Tools. If you drop the Dart files in there, you would see Dart show up in the new boot image wizard inside a Config Manager, and when you check it, it'll add all the pieces. Well, that's only the first piece of it, though. It then would need to run the remote control agent. That requires customizing the task sequence. If you wanted those connection details to be able to initiate the remote control without typing in the ticket and the IP and the port information, that's not provided. So you would want to enable monitoring for that. But we were concerned about the monitoring with Config Manager and scale and the fact that some steps, the MDT ones would report progress, but the Config Manager built-in ones wouldn't. So we'd get a mixed view of the deployment process. So there's additional work that we would need to do to make that clean, make that available to Config Manager. Now, if you actually look at the light touch deployment process, the way it works from a client side is it sets the event service task sequence variable through custom settings to say, client scripts, you need to report your progress to this URL. There's nothing preventing you from doing that with Config Manager, and it would report progress back okay and everything would actually work. But we don't know when the task sequence is done. So at the end of the process, it would just keep counting, and the time would go until about 4 hours, and then we would say, this machine's not responding anymore, because there's no finished event that gets sent through to let us know that the deployment's done. So it's part of the way there, but not enough that we would say we support Config Manager monitoring in MDT 2012. That's something that we're looking at extending for the next release if we have time. Sure. Yeah, it's on the list. I'm hoping that we can get to that.
Thanks.
In the scenario of a refresh, a computer's already a member of the domain. Do you support OST staging OUs?
So the
Moving
question
into an OST
was
staging?
around staging OUs if the computer's already in a domain. It's more of an OS challenge than it is an MDT or config manager challenge. That if there's an existing computer object and you say to join the domain and specify a different OU, the OU is going to be ignored.
Right.
So most people end up dealing with that with custom scripts or web services that move the computer into the correct OU during the deployment process. Then at the end of the process, move it back into the right place so that it's in the staging OU for the appropriate amount of time. But there's nothing provided out of the box in MDT related to that. The biggest challenge is that you would typically want to do that in Windows PE. There's no ADSI support in Windows PE, so you would want to use a web service. Well, providing a web service, deploying the web service, documenting how to do the web service, we could do all of that, but we don't by default because Mike Koster has put a good set of web services out on Codeplex that you can download, install, and configure to then integrate those into your task sequence to take care of those particular challenges. But it'll take some customization to do that. Okay, well, we should probably clear off the stage, but we'll hang around up front if there are any other questions. Thanks.